Case number 1. Donald Eugene Gates. FBI agent Michael Malone testified that Donald Eugene Gates's hair was an exact microscopic match to pubic hairs found on Catherine Schilling's body. A paid police informant swore Gates had confessed to the murder. The jury convicted Gates of rape and felony murder in 1982. Gates was sentenced to 20 years to life. 28 years later, DNA testing on vaginal swabs completely excluded Gates. The DNA matched a serial offender who had committed additional murders while Gates sat in prison. The informant later admitted he fabricated the entire confession for $1,300. The Department of Justice admitted Agent Malone's testimony was scientifically indefensible. Gates's exoneration forced the FBI to launch a historic audit of thousands of hair microscopy cases nationwide. The hair never matched. The confession was bought and paid for. Donald Eugene Gates was 30 in August 1981, a transient day laborer living in Washington, D.C. He was born in Ohio in 1951 and raised in a working-class environment. Gates had a high school education and worked occasional day labor jobs. He was impoverished, single, and had no children. His criminal record consisted of minor nonviolent offenses, petty theft, nothing serious. He was known in D.C. as a drifter, someone on the margins, barely visible to most people. Gates had no connection to Catherine Schilling. He did not know her. When Schilling was murdered in Rock Creek Park and police needed a suspect, a paid informant gave them Gates's name. His poverty and invisibility made him an easy target. Catherine Schilling, 21, was a Georgetown University student working as an intern. She was ambitious and well-liked, close to her parents in New Jersey. On the morning of August 1981, Schilling was walking through Rock Creek Park on her way to work. It was a routine commute through a heavily wooded urban park. She was alone because the park was vast, isolated in places, far from roads and witnesses. Her vulnerability was circumstantial. She was walking alone through dense foliage where no one could see or hear. She was doing what she did every day. Someone was waiting. August 1981. Rock Creek Park, Washington, D.C. Catherine Schilling was ambushed while walking through the park. The attacker dragged her off the trail into dense brush. She was strangled and sexually assaulted. The killer left her body hidden in the foliage. Several hours later, a jogger spotted the body off the trail and called police. Investigators arrived within minutes and processed the scene. The crime appeared to be a sexual assault and robbery, a crime of opportunity with no indication of premeditation. Pubic hairs were found on Schilling's body. In 1981, DNA testing technology was not advanced enough to analyze biological evidence. The pubic hairs became the centerpiece of the forensic investigation. Police had little else. Investigators had no eyewitness and no direct physical evidence beyond the hairs. Several months into the investigation, a police informant came forward. He claimed Donald Eugene Gates had confessed to him. Police paid the informant $1,300. The informant's story gave police a suspect. FBI agent Michael Malone examined the pubic hairs recovered from Schilling's body. Malone concluded that Gates' hair was an exact microscopic match to the hairs found on the victim. The prosecution would later praise the FBI's cutting-edge forensic work. In 1982, Gates was arrested in Washington, D.C., and charged with rape and felony murder. The U.S. Attorney's Office prosecuted the case. Gates was assigned a court-appointed public defender. He pleaded not guilty. The defense attempted to suppress the informant's testimony and argued the hair science was subjective. Both motions failed. The trial took place in 1982 in D.C. Superior Court. The prosecution's case rested on two pillars: the paid informant's testimony that Gates had confessed, and FBI agent Michael Malone's testimony that Gates' hair was an exact microscopic match to hairs on the victim. The informant testified that Gates admitted to the crime. Malone testified with the authority of the FBI behind him. The defense argued the informant was lying for money and that hair microscopy was unreliable. The jury heard the FBI expert present his findings as scientific certainty. Gates took the stand and denied all involvement. He maintained his absolute innocence. The jury convicted him of all counts in 1982. Gates wept as the verdict was read. Gates was sentenced to 20 years to life with concurrent sentences. He maintained his innocence at sentencing. Prosecutors praised the FBI's forensic science. Gates entered prison in 1982 and remained there for 28 years. He filed multiple federal habeas corpus petitions over the years. All were denied. In 2009, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze the vaginal swabs recovered from Catherine Schilling's body. The results completely excluded Donald Eugene Gates. The DNA matched an unknown male, later identified as a serial offender. Investigators discovered the real killer had committed additional murders while Gates was incarcerated. The Department of Justice reviewed Agent Malone's testimony. The DOJ admitted Malone had provided false, scientifically indefensible testimony. The informant who claimed Gates confessed later admitted he had fabricated the entire story in exchange for the $1,300 payment. Gates was exonerated and released in December 2009 after serving 28 years. He received a $16.6 million settlement. His exoneration became the catalyst that forced the FBI to launch a historic audit of thousands of hair microscopy cases. Donald Eugene Gates is 73 years old. FBI agent Michael Malone testified Gates' hair was an exact microscopic match. A paid informant swore Gates confessed. The jury believed both. 28 years later, DNA excluded Gates completely and identified a serial killer who murdered again while Gates was in prison. The informant admitted he lied for $1,300. The FBI admitted Malone's testimony was scientifically indefensible. Gates' exoneration forced the FBI to audit thousands of cases. 28 years. The hair never matched. The confession was bought and paid for. The real killer kept killing. Case number 2. Joseph Sledge. Joseph Sledge Jr. escaped from a minimum security prison on September 5, 1976. He was serving a short sentence for theft. The next day, 2 elderly women were found brutally murdered in their home in nearby Elizabethtown, North Carolina. Sledge was an escaped inmate in the immediate geographic area. A State Bureau of Investigation analyst testified that pubic hairs found on one victim's abdomen were a microscopic match to Sledge. 2 jailhouse informants claimed Sledge had bragged about the murders. Sledge was convicted of 2 counts of second-degree murder in 1978 and sentenced to consecutive life sentences. 37 years later, DNA testing on the hairs and semen found at the scene completely excluded Sledge. The jailhouse informants formally recanted, admitting they had lied for leniency on their own charges. Sledge was exonerated in January 2015. He spent nearly 4 decades in maximum security for a double murder because he escaped a minimum security prison where he was serving a short sentence for theft. Wrong place, wrong time. Joseph Sledge Jr. was 34 in September 1976, living in North Carolina. He was born in 1942 and raised in the state. Sledge was a high school dropout who worked transient labor jobs when he could find them. He was single, had no children, and lived in poverty. His criminal record consisted of nonviolent offenses, larceny, receiving stolen goods, petty crimes that kept him cycling through the system. He was known for minor thefts, but had no history of violence. On September 5th, 1976, Sledge walked away from a work detail at a minimum security prison. He was serving a short sentence for theft. The escape was low-level, not violent. He simply left. The next day, 2 women were murdered in Elizabethtown. Because Sledge was an escaped inmate in the geographic area, he became the suspect. Geography destroyed his life. Josephine Davis, 74, and her daughter Aileen Davis, 57, lived together in their home in Elizabethtown, Bladen County, North Carolina. Josephine was elderly and retired. Aileen, her adult daughter, lived with her and cared for her. They were quiet, respected women in their rural community. They lived in a secluded area, far from neighbors. On September 6, 1976, someone entered their home. Both women were brutally beaten and stabbed to death. The killer left their bodies in the home and fled. They had no connection to Joseph Sledge. They were complete strangers. September 6, 1976. Elizabethtown, Bladen County, North Carolina. Josephine Davis and Aileen Davis were attacked in their home. Both were brutally beaten and stabbed to death. The attack appeared to be a burglary or robbery. The killer left the bodies in the home. Less than 24 hours later, a family member arrived to visit and discovered the bodies. Police responded immediately and processed the scene. Investigators found pubic hairs on Josephine Davis's abdomen. Blood and other evidence were collected, but in 1976, DNA testing was not available. The pubic hairs became the focus of the forensic investigation. The timeline was damning for Joseph Sledge. He had escaped from prison on September 5th. The murders occurred on September 6th. He was nearby, on the run, and desperate. Police had an obvious suspect. Sledge was an escaped inmate in the immediate area. Within days, police arrested him. He was found in a stolen vehicle in a neighboring town. The State Bureau of Investigation analyzed the pubic hairs found on Josephine Davis's abdomen. The SBI analyst concluded the hairs were a microscopic match to Sledge. While in jail awaiting trial, Sledge was housed with other inmates. 2 of them later came forward and claimed Sledge had bragged about killing the Davis women. Both informants were facing their own criminal charges and were seeking leniency. The case against Sledge was built almost entirely on the SBI hair testimony and the jailhouse informants. There was no eyewitness. There was no direct physical evidence beyond the hairs. Sledge was charged with 2 counts of second-degree murder. He pleaded not guilty. North Carolina does not have the death penalty for second-degree murder, so he faced life in prison. The trial took place in 1978 in Columbus County Courthouse, North Carolina. The prosecution called the SBI hair analyst and the 2 jailhouse informants as key witnesses. The SBI analyst testified that the pubic hairs found on Josephine Davis were a microscopic match to Joseph Sledge. The informants testified that Sledge had bragged about the murders while in jail. The defense had no resources to hire competing forensic experts. The jury heard the SBI analyst present the hair match as scientific certainty, and the informants corroborated with Sledge's alleged confession. The verdict came in 1978. Sledge was convicted of both counts of second-degree murder. He swore he was innocent. No one listened. Sledge was sentenced to life in prison. The sentences were consecutive, meaning he would serve them back to back. He entered the North Carolina prison system in 1978 and remained there for 37 years. Between 1980 and 2002, Sledge filed over 25 pro se motions, legal filings he wrote himself, seeking relief. All were denied. In 2012, advances in DNA technology allowed testing on the pubic hairs and semen found at the crime scene. The DNA results completely excluded Joseph Sledge. The biological evidence did not match him. Attorneys contacted the 2 jailhouse informants who had testified against Sledge. both formally recanted. They admitted they had lied about Sledge bragging about the murders. They had lied for leniency on their own charges. Sledge was exonerated in January 2015 after serving 37 years in prison. The case spurred audits of SBI hair analysis cases across North Carolina. National media covered the exoneration heavily, focusing on the North Carolina Innocence Inquiry Commission. Sledge walked free at age 73. He died in 2020 at age 78. He had 5 years of freedom. Joseph Sledge died in 2020 at age 78. He spent nearly 4 decades in maximum security for a double murder because a state analyst falsely matched a pubic hair. He escaped a minimum security prison where he was serving a short sentence for theft. The next day, 2 women were murdered nearby. Geography made him a suspect. SBI hair testimony made him a convict. Jailhouse snitches lied for leniency. 37 years later, DNA excluded him completely. The informants recanted. Sledge walked free in 2015. 5 years of freedom. 37 years stolen. Wrong place, wrong time. Case number 3. Anthony Wright. Philadelphia detectives fabricated the entire confession document. They beat Anthony Wright during interrogation and forced him to sign a blank piece of paper. Later, they filled in the confession. A forensic analyst testified that hairs found on the victim's clothing microscopically matched Wright perfectly. The hair evidence was explicitly used to scientifically corroborate the fabricated confession. The prosecution sought the death penalty. The jury deadlocked on death, but convicted Wright of first-degree murder, rape, robbery, and burglary. Wright was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole in 1993. 25 years later, DNA testing on sperm and hairs found at the scene matched Ronnie Bird, a notorious local enforcer who had died in 2013. The DNA completely excluded Anthony Wright. The confession was torture. The hair match was junk science. Wright lost 25 years to evidence manufactured by police and validated by forensic fraud. Anthony Wright was 20 in October 1991, living in North Philadelphia. He was born in Philadelphia in 1971. Wright was single, had no children, and had a record of minor nonviolent offenses. Nothing serious, nothing violent. He lived in the same neighborhood as Louise Talley. When Talley was murdered, police needed a suspect. They pressured crack addicts in the neighborhood to give them a name in exchange for leniency on drug charges. Wright's name surfaced. Police brought him in for questioning. What happened next was torture dressed as interrogation. Louise Talley, 77, was retired and living alone in her home in North Philadelphia. She had no connection to Anthony Wright beyond living in the same neighborhood. Talley managed her household independently. She was alone, with no immediate access to help if something went wrong. October 19th, 1991. Louise Talley's home, North Philadelphia. Talley was attacked in her home. She was stabbed multiple times and raped. The attack appeared to be motivated by robbery and sexual assault. Blood evidence, hairs, and sperm were recovered from the scene. Investigators processed the evidence, but no immediate suspect emerged. Police began questioning people in the neighborhood. Police had no physical evidence linking Wright to the crime. They pressured neighborhood crack addicts to name someone. The addicts, facing their own charges, gave police Anthony Wright's name in exchange for leniency. Police brought Wright in for interrogation. During questioning, detectives beat Wright. They choked him, struck him, and terrorized him until he could no longer resist. Then they placed a blank piece of paper in front of him and forced him to sign it. Wright signed. After Wright was returned to his cell, the detectives filled in the confession document themselves. They fabricated the entire statement. Wright desperately claimed he was being tortured, but he had no proof. Then forensic analysts examined hairs found on Louise Talley's clothing. The analysts concluded the hairs microscopically matched Wright perfectly. The prosecution used the hair evidence to scientifically corroborate the fabricated confession. If the hairs matched, Wright must have been there. The torture claims must be lies. Wright was arrested in October 1991, within days of the murder. He was charged with first-degree murder, rape, robbery, and burglary. He pleaded not guilty. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. The trial took place in 1993 in Philadelphia County. The prosecution presented the signed confession and the hair testimony. A forensic analyst testified that hairs found on the victim's clothing microscopically matched Anthony Wright perfectly. The prosecution framed the hair evidence as scientific proof that corroborated the confession. Wright's claims of torture were dismissed. The hair match made the confession credible. The defense had limited resources and could not effectively challenge the fabricated confession or the hair science. The jury heard the confession and the microscopic match testimony. In the penalty phase, the jury deadlocked on the death penalty. Wright was convicted in 1993 and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Wright entered the Pennsylvania prison system in 1993 and remained there for 25 years. Appeals were filed over the years. In 2013, DNA testing was conducted on sperm and hairs recovered from the crime scene. The DNA results matched Ronnie Bird, a notorious local enforcer known in North Philadelphia. Bird had died in 2013 before the DNA identification. The DNA completely excluded Anthony Wright. Attorneys reviewed the confession document and the circumstances of Wright's interrogation. The torture became undeniable. The confession was fabricated. Wright was exonerated in August 2016 after serving 25 years in prison. He sued the city of Philadelphia. The city settled for nearly $10 million. Anthony Wright is 53 years old. Philadelphia detectives fabricated the entire confession document, beating Wright and forcing him to sign a blank piece of paper. A forensic analyst testified hairs on the victim microscopically matched Wright perfectly. The hair evidence was explicitly used to scientifically corroborate the fabricated confession. 25 years later, DNA matched Ronnie Bird, a notorious local enforcer who had died in 2013. The confession was torture. The hair match was junk. Wright lost 25 years. The real killer's DNA was on the victim all along. Case number 4, Stephen Linscott. Stephen Linscott approached police with a bizarre claim. He said he had experienced a psychic dream about the murder of his neighbor, Karen Phillips. The dream, Linscott told investigators, loosely matched details of the crime. Police found the claim suspicious. An analyst examined pubic hairs found at the crime scene and testified they were consistent with Linscott. The prosecution intentionally exaggerated the analyst's testimony to the jury, turning consistent into an absolute mathematical match with statistical certainty. The jury convicted Linscott of murder in 1982. He was sentenced to 40 years in prison. 12 years later, DNA testing on semen and hair found at the scene completely excluded Stephen Linscott. An appeals court later reviewed the case and lambasted the prosecution for egregious misconduct, stating they had deliberately twisted the analyst's testimony. The psychic dream was bizarre. The hair testimony was exaggerated into a lie. Linscott lost 12 years to prosecutorial manipulation dressed as science. Stephen Linscott was 26 in October 1980, living in Oak Park, Illinois. He was married and worked as a volunteer at a Christian halfway house. Linscott was deeply religious, quiet, and known in his community as respectable and kind. He lived near Karen Phillips. They were neighbors, familiar to each other, but not close. When Phillips was murdered, Linscott made a decision that would destroy his life. He went to the police and claimed he had experienced a psychic dream about the murder. The dream, he said, contained details that matched the crime. Police listened. The dream made him a suspect. Karen Phillips, 24, was a nursing student living alone in Oak Park, Illinois. She was pursuing her education and managing her household independently. Her living situation, a young woman alone, made her vulnerable. Phillips and Linscott were neighbors. They knew each other by proximity, but had no close relationship. October 4th, 1980. Oak Park, Illinois. Karen Phillips was attacked in her home. She was beaten with a tire iron and strangled. The violence was severe. Phillips died from her injuries. Investigators processed the scene and recovered pubic hairs and semen. In 1980, DNA testing was not available. The pubic hairs became the primary forensic evidence. Police had little else to work with. Stephen Linscott walked into the police station. He told investigators he had experienced a psychic dream about Karen Phillips' murder. The dream, he claimed, loosely matched some details of the crime. Police found the claim strange and suspicious. How did Linscott know details of the crime unless he was involved? Investigators brought in a forensic analyst to examine the pubic hairs found at the scene. The analyst compared them to samples from Linscott. The analyst testified that the hairs were consistent with Linscott. Consistent meant they shared some characteristics, but the analyst did not claim they were a definitive match. The word consistent left room for doubt. Linscott was arrested shortly after his psychic dream claim. He was charged with murder and pleaded not guilty. The trial took place in 1982 in Cook County, Illinois. The prosecution called the forensic analyst as a key witness. The analyst testified that the pubic hairs found at the scene were consistent with Stephen Linscott. The analyst used the word consistent, not match. But the prosecution intentionally exaggerated the testimony to the jury. Prosecutors told jurors the hair evidence was an absolute mathematical match, claiming statistical certainty the analyst never stated. The defense had no resources to hire competing experts. The jury heard what they believed was scientific certainty. Linscott was convicted of murder in 1982. He maintained his innocence. The verdict stood. Linscott was sentenced to 40 years in prison. He entered the Illinois prison system in 1982. Appeals were filed over the years. In 1992, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze the semen and hair found at the crime scene. The DNA results completely excluded Stephen Linscott. He had no biological connection to the crime. Appellate attorneys reviewed the trial record and the prosecution's presentation of the hair evidence. The appeals court examined the prosecution's conduct. The court found that prosecutors had intentionally exaggerated the hair analyst's testimony, turning consistent into an absolute match the analyst never claimed. The court called this egregious prosecutorial misconduct. Linscott was exonerated in 1992 after serving approximately 10 years in prison. Stephen Linscott is 70 years old. He approached police claiming a psychic dream about Karen Phillips' murder. An analyst testified pubic hairs were consistent with Linscott. The prosecution intentionally exaggerated the testimony, turning consistent into an absolute mathematical match. The jury heard certainty the analyst never claimed. 12 years later, DNA excluded Linscott completely. The appeals court lambasted the prosecution for egregious misconduct. The psychic dream was bizarre. The hair testimony was twisted into a fabrication. Linscott lost 12 years to prosecutorial lies dressed as science. Case number 5, Ronald Jones. Detective John Burge's squad beat a confession out of Ronald Jones. Burge and his officers were notorious in Chicago for torturing suspects into confessing to crimes. They choked Jones, struck him, and terrorized him until he signed a confession. The state bolstered the tortured confession with forensic testimony. A hair analyst testified that hairs found at the crime scene matched Jones perfectly under a microscope. The hair evidence affirmed the confession. The jury convicted Jones of murder in 1989. He was sentenced to death. Jones spent 10 years on death row waiting to be executed. In 1997, DNA testing on semen recovered from the scene completely excluded Ronald Jones. He was exonerated and pardoned in 1999. Decades later, John Burge was convicted of torture and perjury related to dozens of cases. The confession was beaten out of a homeless man. The hair match was junk. Jones nearly died because forensic science validated a lie extracted through torture. Ronald Jones was 33 in March 1985, living on the south side of Chicago. He was unemployed and homeless, struggling with substance abuse. Jones had no stable housing, no income, and no support system. He was one of thousands of marginalized people in Chicago, invisible to most, vulnerable to everyone. When Lois Jean Cameron was murdered in an abandoned motel, Jones became a target of John Burge's torture squad. Burge's reputation was well known in Chicago. His squad extracted confessions through violence. Jones was vulnerable, expendable. Lois Jean Cameron, 28, was unemployed and struggling with substance abuse. Like Jones, she was living on the margins, transient, without stable housing. Her vulnerability was circumstantial. She was alone, struggling, with no one to protect her. March 10, 1985. An abandoned motel on the south side of Chicago. Lois Jean Cameron was in the abandoned building when she was attacked. She was brutally beaten and stabbed. Her body was found in the motel. Investigators processed the scene and recovered semen and hairs. In 1985, DNA testing was available but not widely used. The hairs became the focus of the investigation. Chicago police targeted Ronald Jones. Detectives from John Burge's squad brought him in for interrogation. Burge's methods were brutal and consistent. His officers beat suspects, choked them, electrocuted them, and terrorized them until they confessed. Jones was no exception. Detectives beat Jones during the interrogation. They choked him until he could no longer resist. Jones signed a confession. He confessed to murdering Lois Jean Cameron. The confession was torture, but Jones had no way to prove it. Then the state brought in a forensic analyst to examine hairs found at the crime scene. The analyst testified that the hairs matched Jones perfectly under a microscope. The hair evidence bolstered the tortured confession. If the hairs matched, the confession must be real. Jones was charged with murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. The trial took place in 1989 in Cook County. The prosecution presented the signed confession and the hair testimony. The state's hair analyst testified that hairs found at the scene matched Ronald Jones perfectly under a microscope. The hair evidence was used to affirm the confession. Jones's claims of torture were dismissed. The defense could not prove the torture or counter the hair science. The jury convicted Jones of murder in 1989. He was sentenced to death. Jones was sent to death row. Jones remained on death row for 10 years. In 1997, DNA testing was conducted on the semen recovered from Lois Jean Cameron's body. The DNA results completely excluded Ronald Jones. The biological evidence did not match him. He had no connection to the crime. Jones was exonerated and pardoned in 1999 after spending a decade on death row. Years later, John Burge was convicted of torture and perjury. Dozens of cases were linked to Burge's torture methods. Jones was one of many victims. Ronald Jones spent a decade on death row waiting to be executed. Detective John Burge's squad beat a confession out of him. The state's hair analyst testified hairs at the scene matched Jones perfectly, affirming the tortured confession. 10 years later, DNA testing on the semen completely excluded Jones. He was pardoned in 1999. The confession was torture. The hair match was junk. Jones nearly died because the state's forensic science validated a lie beaten out of a homeless man. 10 years. Death row. Innocent. Case number 6. Drew Whitley. The killer dropped a trench coat and a stocking mask while fleeing the scene. Physical evidence left behind in a panic. Evidence that should have solved the case immediately. A state crime lab analyst examined hairs found inside the discarded stocking mask and testified they perfectly matched Drew Whitley's hair. An anonymous tip had directed police to Whitley. The jury convicted him of murder in 1989. Whitley was sentenced to life in prison. 17 years later, DNA testing on the hairs from the mask proved they did not belong to Whitley. During appeals, the state argued desperately that Whitley could have simply borrowed the mask from the real killer. The judge completely rejected the absurd theory. The mask held the killer's DNA all along. The anonymous tip was wrong. The hair match was wrong. 17 years. Drew Whitley was 33 in August 1988, living in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania, near Duquesne, when Noreen Malloy was murdered during an armed robbery at a McDonald's parking lot. Police received an anonymous tip. The caller named Drew Whitley. The tip made him a suspect. Hair found inside a discarded stocking mask made him a convict. Noreen Malloy, 22, managed a McDonald's restaurant in Duquesne, Pennsylvania. On the night of August 1988, Malloy closed the restaurant after her shift. She secured the building, counted the nightly deposit, and walked to her car in the parking lot. She was alone, carrying the store's cash. It was routine. She had done it many times before. The parking lot was dark. No one was nearby. Her routine made her a target. August 1988. McDonald's parking lot, Duquesne, Pennsylvania. Noreen Malloy walked to her car carrying the nightly deposit. Someone was waiting. The attacker confronted Malloy in the parking lot. It was an armed robbery. The attacker wanted the deposit. Malloy was shot during the robbery. She died from her injuries. The killer fled the scene. During the flight, the killer dropped a trench coat and a stocking mask. The evidence fell to the ground in the panic. Police arrived and processed the scene. They recovered the trench coat and the stocking mask. Both items smelled strongly of another individual. Hairs were found inside the stocking mask. The dropped evidence should have solved the case. Police recovered the trench coat and stocking mask. An anonymous tip came into the police station. The caller named Drew Whitley as a suspect. Police focused their investigation on Whitley based on the tip. A state crime lab analyst examined the hairs found inside the stocking mask. The analyst compared them to samples taken from Whitley. The analyst testified that the hairs perfectly matched Whitley's hair. Despite the trench coat and mask smelling strongly of another individual, the hair match focused the investigation entirely on Whitley. He was arrested shortly after August 1988 and charged with murder and armed robbery. He pleaded not guilty. The trial took place in 1989 in Allegheny County, Pennsylvania. The prosecution's case rested on the anonymous tip and the hair match. A state crime lab analyst testified that hairs found inside the discarded stocking mask perfectly matched Drew Whitley's hair. The defense argued the hair science was unreliable and noted that the coat and mask smelled of someone else entirely. The jury believed the hair match. Whitley was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to life in prison. He maintained his innocence. Whitley entered the Pennsylvania prison system in 1989 and remained there for 17 years. Appeals were filed. In 2006, DNA testing was conducted on the hairs from the stocking mask. The DNA results proved the hairs did not belong to Drew Whitley. The biological evidence pointed to someone else entirely. During the appeals process, the state made a desperate argument. Prosecutors claimed Whitley could have simply borrowed the mask from the real killer. The theory was absurd. The judge completely rejected it. If the DNA in the mask belonged to someone else, that person was the killer. The mask had been dropped during the flight from the murder. The real killer's DNA was inside it. Whitley was exonerated in May 2006 after serving 17 years in prison. Drew Whitley is 68 years old. An anonymous tip named him. A state crime lab analyst testified hairs inside a discarded stocking mask perfectly matched Whitley's hair. 17 years later, DNA proved the hairs were not his. The state argued during appeals that Whitley could have simply borrowed the mask from the real killer. The judge rejected the absurd theory. The mask held the killer's DNA all along. The hair match was wrong. The anonymous tip was wrong. 17 years. The borrowed mask theory was desperation dressed as argument. Case number 7. Kevin Bailey Burge squad detectives choked Kevin Bailey until he confessed. John Burge's officers were notorious for torturing suspects in Chicago. They choked Bailey, beat him, and terrorized him until he signed a confession to the murder of Lula Murphy. Bailey desperately claimed he was being physically tortured. Then the prosecution brought in a forensic analyst. A single hair had been found on a Domino's pizza box at the crime scene. The analyst testified the hair was microscopically linked to Bailey, proving he had been in the house. The hair evidence was explicitly used to dismiss and discredit Bailey's torture claims. If the hair matched, he was in the house. The torture claims must be lies. Bailey was convicted in 1989 and sentenced to 80 years in prison. 28 years later, DNA testing proved the hair on the pizza box belonged to an unknown third party. The analyst had sworn under oath the hair belonged to Bailey. It did not. The confession was torture. The hair was used to validate the torture. Bailey lost 28 years. Kevin Bailey was 19 in June 1989, living in Chicago. When Lula Murphy was murdered, Bailey became a target of John Burge's torture squad. Burge's reputation in Chicago was well established by 1989. His detectives extracted confessions through violence. Bailey was young, vulnerable. Lula Murphy, 89, lived alone in her home in Chicago. Her extreme age made her especially vulnerable. She had no connection to Kevin Bailey. June 1989. Lula Murphy's home, Chicago. Murphy was in her home when she was attacked. She was strangled and stabbed. The attack appeared to be a robbery. Murphy's body was found in the house. Investigators processed the scene. A single hair was found on a Domino's pizza box at the crime scene. The hair became the centerpiece of the forensic case. Chicago police targeted Kevin Bailey. Detectives from John Burge's squad brought him in for interrogation. Burge's methods were consistent across dozens of cases. His officers choked suspects, beat them, and terrorized them until they confessed. Bailey was no exception. Detectives choked Bailey during questioning. They beat him until he could not resist. Bailey signed a confession. He confessed to murdering Lula Murphy. Bailey desperately claimed he was being physically tortured by police. He told anyone who would listen that the confession was forced. Then the state brought in a forensic analyst to examine the hair found on the Domino's pizza box at Murphy's home. The analyst testified that the hair was microscopically linked to Kevin Bailey. The hair proved Bailey had been in the house. The prosecution explicitly used the hair evidence to dismiss and discredit Bailey's torture claims. If the hair matched, the confession was real. Bailey's torture claims were lies. Bailey was charged with murder and robbery. The trial took place in 1989 in Cook County, Chicago. The prosecution presented the signed confession and the hair testimony. The hair analyst testified that the single hair found on the pizza box at the crime scene was microscopically linked to Kevin Bailey. The hair evidence was used to discredit Bailey's claims of torture. The defense could not prove the torture or counter the hair science. The jury convicted Bailey in 1989. He was sentenced to 80 years in prison. Bailey entered the Illinois prison system in 1989 and remained there for 28 years. In 2017, DNA testing was conducted on the hair from the Domino's pizza box. The DNA results proved the hair belonged to an unknown third party. The hair did not belong to Kevin Bailey. The analyst had sworn under oath that the hair was Bailey's. The DNA proved the analyst was wrong. Bailey was exonerated in 2018 after serving 28 years in prison. Kevin Bailey is free. Burge Squad detectives choked him until he confessed. Bailey desperately claimed he was being tortured. The prosecution used the pizza box hair to prove he was lying. If the hair matched, he was in the house. 28 years later, DNA testing proved the hair the analyst swore belonged to Bailey actually belonged to an unknown third party. The confession was torture. The hair match was junk science used to discredit his torture claims. 80 years, 28 served. The hair was never his. Case number 8, Robert Earl Hayes. A hair was found grasped tightly in Pamela Albertson's hand. She had pulled it from her attacker during the struggle. The hair was defensive evidence, physical proof of who killed her. A state analyst examined the hair and testified it was microscopically matched to Robert Earl Hayes. Hayes was convicted of murder in 1991 and sentenced to death. He spent 7 years on death row. In 1997, DNA testing was conducted on the hair found in Albertson's hand. The DNA proved conclusively that the hair belonged to a white male. Robert Earl Hayes is black. The state analyst had managed to subjectively match a white man's hair to a black man through a microscope. The racial impossibility exposed how completely malleable and subjective hair microscopy was. Hayes was exonerated in 1997. 7 years on death row. The analyst matched a white man's hair to a black man. The science crossed racial lines. Robert Earl Hayes was 26 in 1990, working as a groom at a racetrack in Broward County, Florida. He cared for horses, cleaned stalls, and worked long hours at the track. Hayes is black. When Pamela Albertson, a co-worker at the racetrack, was murdered, Hayes became a suspect. A hair clutched in Albertson's hand was matched to him through microscopy. The hair belonged to a white male. Hayes is black. Pamela Albertson, 22, worked at the racetrack in Broward County. She was a co-worker of Robert Earl Hayes. They worked in the same environment, saw each other regularly, but had no indication of conflict. Broward County, Florida. Pamela Albertson was attacked. She was strangled and beaten. During the struggle, Albertson fought back. She grasped a hair from her attacker and held it tightly in her hand. The hair was defensive evidence. She had pulled it from the person who killed her. Her body was found with the hair still clutched in her hand. Investigators documented the evidence. The hair should have identified the killer. Police focused on the hair in Albertson's hand. The hair was defensive evidence, likely pulled from the attacker during the fight. A state analyst examined the hair and compared it to samples from potential suspects, including Robert Earl Hayes. The analyst concluded that the hair was microscopically matched to Hayes. Hayes worked with Albertson at the racetrack. The hair match made him the prime suspect. Hayes was arrested shortly after 1990 and charged with murder. Prosecutors sought the death penalty. Hayes pleaded not guilty. The trial took place in 1991 in Broward County, Florida. The prosecution's case rested heavily on the hair evidence. The state analyst testified that the hair found, grasped in Pamela Albertson's hand, was microscopically matched to Robert Earl Hayes. The hair was defensive evidence. The victim had grabbed it from her attacker. The match seemed damning. The jury convicted Hayes of murder in 1991. He was sentenced to death. Hayes was sent to death row in Florida. Hayes remained on death row for 7 years. In 1997, DNA testing technology had advanced enough to analyze the hair found in Albertson's hand. The DNA results were definitive. The hair belonged to a white male. Robert Earl Hayes is black. The state analyst had testified under oath that the hair was a microscopic match to Hayes. The DNA proved the analyst was wrong. The analyst had managed to subjectively match a white man's hair to a black man through a microscope. The revelation highlighted how completely malleable and racially biased the science of hair microscopy was. There was no objective standard. The analyst had looked through a microscope and matched hair across racial lines. Hayes was exonerated in 1997 after spending 7 years on death row. Robert Earl Hayes is free. A hair was found grasped tightly in Pamela Albertson's hand, defensive evidence she pulled from her attacker. A state analyst microscopically matched it to Hayes. 7 years later, DNA testing proved the hair belonged to a white male. Hayes is black. The analyst managed to subjectively match a white man's hair to a black man through a microscope. 7 years on death row. The hair microscopy was so malleable, so subjective, it crossed racial lines. The science was junk. The racial bias was absolute. Case number